Tonight we're talking about energy nationalism in Latin America and the Caribbean. There have been this whole spate of articles over the past 6 months how the center of the world energy industry is shifting, some will say has shifted, to the Western Hemisphere. There's been new finds of oil off the coast of Brazil, onshore in Brazil. Colombia is producing close to 1 million barrels of oil a day. Canada has got huge amounts of oil. A fair amount of the Mexican presidential election was, what are we going to do with Pemex? And so there's been a great deal of focus and talk about energy in the Western Hemisphere. But at the same time, there has been energy nationalism, which is not a new phenomenon, and was one of the key movers of the Mexican Revolution, in fact, was energy nationalism. And across Latin America, there's a huge effort by politicians varies in one country to another, but for the state, for governments to control that energy, to control it more closely, to take it to ensure that, in their terms, the national patrimony is used to serve the people of the country. And so tonight we've brought together a panel to discuss that. I've got, if I can find it, I'm going to introduce these people. This is the shortened version of their biographies. They've got very long and impressive bios that I've shortened. You can find them online. Starting at my left, actually, you're sitting in order even. Got Professor David Victor, who is, this is luck, who is Director of the Laboratory in International Law and Regulation at the School of International Relations Pacific Studies, this pointy building next door, so you had a long commute here. David is a professor at the IRPS, director of the school's new laboratory on international law and regulation. His research focuses on how the design of regulatory law affects issues such as environmental pollution and the operation of major energy markets. He's the author of Global Warming Gridlock. He's taught at Stanford and directed the Science and Technology program at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and works on innovation and the impact of innovation on economic growth. Is that about have it? Okay. Pamela Starr is the director of the U.S.-Mexico Network and associate professor, parentheses, teaching, close parentheses, of international relations at the University of Southern California. I assume most professors don't teach at USC? So, there must be a reason for that. I can't figure it out. Anyhow, Dr. Starr is director of the U.S.-Mexico Network, an associate professor in public diplomacy and the School of International Relations, and a university fellow at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. She came to USC from the Eurasia Group, where she was the senior analyst responsible for Mexico. She spent 8 years in Mexico as professor of Latin American political economy at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM, in Mexico City. She's advised the Secretary of State, other high-ranking U.S. and Mexican officials, and other people who need advice. And has worked as a consultant to investment banks and securities firms. She's got her Ph.D. from the University of Southern California. Nelson, is that a good summary? Did I got it? Did I leave anything out? Okay, Nelson Altamirano is professor and lead faculty sustainability management at the School of Business and Management at National University. He's director and coordinator of online programs at the School of Business and Management. He holds a PhD in international economic policy and management from UCSD. IRPS. Wow. Fabulous. So you've come home. You've come home, full circle. He's taught economics and managerial economics at universities in Peru, Colombia, and Japan. He speaks fluent Japanese. That's not true. Okay. He's been a consultant and researcher at the Peruvian Central Bank, the Institute of Peruvian Studies, Instituto Cuanto, and Natural Resources Division of ECLAC, also known as CEPAL, on mining, development, and energy issues. Jeremy Martin is the director of the energy program at the Institute of the Americas, and I'm not going to tell everybody what you've done because that's enough right there. I'm going to repeat my name for you in case you missed it. I'm Charles Shapiro. I'm the president of the Institute of the Americas, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to David Victor.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Each of us have been asked to talk for no more than 10 minutes to help set the scene as we see it. And the theme tonight is energy nationalism in the Americas, or in Latin America in particular, and that really means the role of national oil companies, because the main instrument the governments use to convey nationalism is control over the oil industry. And there are a lot of ways to control the oil industry, but the way that most governments do it is they own the means of production, the national oil company. And so I'd like to say three things about national oil companies, starting from the very big macro global picture and then moving down to the picture in Latin America, and in particular the huge variation in performance of national oil companies in Latin America. And my remarks are going to be based heavily on a book that our lab put out a few months ago called Oil and Governance. This is a study that took a team of about a dozen scholars about 5 years to put together. It's, I believe, the largest and most systematic analysis of the 15 big national oil companies worldwide. So we've tried to understand what explains the variation in performance of national oil companies around the world. And that means that we've been looking at the big ones in Latin America, in particular in Venezuela, Mexico, and Brazil. But we've also been looking at the major companies in the Gulf, in Russia, Statoil in Norway, and a handful of others. My own work has been heavily focused on, actually, on Abu Dhabi and on Pemex and on Petrobras. So the first thing I want to say is, although we're kind of impressed by the large role of national oil companies in the Latin American oil industry, of course, this is the norm in most of the world. 80% of the world's oil resources are controlled in various ways by national oil companies. And that number is maybe a little higher, a little bit lower, depending on how you define the term resource, as Bill Clinton might remind us. But this is normal in this industry, is state control of the means of production. This is actually normal across the energy industry, not just in oil. It's in infrastructure more generally. If you look at the electric power system, this country, the United States, is very unusual in the large role for privately owned, heavily regulated, albeit, but privately owned utilities. Almost all the rest of the world, big means of production in electric power sector and delivery, transmission delivery, are all owned by the state. You know, all the big Chinese power producers are owned by the state. There are many of them, so they compete with each other, but they're all owned by the same shareholder, as it were. So this is normal, and this is a reflection of a long-standing kind of struggle or debate about what's the role of government in the economy. And most countries resolved that debate in ways that gave the government a dominant role in the means of production for so-called critical industries. Now, of course, when you run one of these companies, you love your industry to be critical because then you get all these other benefits from being state-owned and so on. What makes oil different, of course, is the quantity of rent sloshing around is so massive. But I think it's just very important that we keep some perspective here. A lot of what we're going to talk about here tonight is not unique to the oil industry. We're particularly worried about state ownership and nationalism, I think, for two broad reasons. One is we think that this has an effect on the performance of the company. And the evidence is overwhelming. If we did not have state ownership of the oil industry, the price of oil today probably would be $30 a barrel. Other problems would be worse, like global warming would be worse and so on. But the quantity of oil that's not available to the market and the shape and the structure of the supply curves is totally different as a result of that. And that's a reflection of performance. Business strategy and politics and so on as well. But we're concerned about this in part for reasons of performance, and we're also concerned about this because when the state is heavily involved in controlling these kinds of rents, then there are all kinds of effects on the economy, so-called Dutch disease. I think that happens to be massively overblown as a concern. But the so-called resource curse is a huge problem, where basically politics, as we've seen maybe in the most extreme form in Venezuela, politics becomes obsessed about controlling the flow of rents. And that has a harmful effect on the political system, on democracy, on the economy, and things like that. So that's the first point I'd like to make as a kind of macro perspective. The second thing, to pick up on what Charles Shapiro was mentioning in his opening remarks, which is there's all this stuff in the press nowadays about the shifting center of gravity of the oil industry to the West. And what that really is code for the shifting center of gravity of the oil industry to a series of technological innovations that have made previously unavailable resources now available. Oil sands, ultra deep, in particular, have been much in the news right now. So the pre-salt finding would not have been possible to even go find the pre-salt, let alone know something about the size of this. This is the big finding offshore in Brazil. Almost certainly a similar formation exists off the west coast of Angola, probably in lots of other places of the world as well. This just would not have been possible without all kinds of innovations, of which Petrobras has been somewhat involved, but a lot of other companies as well, around offshore drilling, around ultra-high pressure submersible robotics, and the list goes on and on and on. So really what's happened in this industry is there's been this technological revolution that's washed across the industry, and it happens to have had a disproportionate effect of the role of the West in all of this. 2012 today is an unusual moment in that history, because we've seen for the last 10, 12 years a kind of seemingly inexorable rise in the price of oil, and therefore the rents that flow to governments that control that oil production. At the same time, though, almost everywhere in the world, and Latin America is no exception, government expectations for the amount of money that's going to be coming in have also risen as well. So you've got these two curves, where you've got the curve that tells you about the quantity of rents, excess money sloshing around as a result of the unusually high price of oil, and that curve has soared, and then government expectations have risen as well. And now the cost basis for new production is rising and so on, all of which is squeezing rents. Now this revolution that Charles Shapiro was talking about is really important because it's brought down prices. There are lots of things going on in the oil market right now, but new supplies have helped bring prices down from the level they would be otherwise. And so you're seeing a squeeze. This squeeze, and I would be keen for the experts in the region to talk more about this in their remarks or in our Q&A, this squeeze is a huge deal. And it's evident not only in this region, but also, for example, in Russia. The promises that Putin made to get reelected, it also helps to be able to shoot your opponents and put them in jail and things like that. But the promises that Putin made for infrastructure spending and so on, in effect, require the Russian government to have a long-term price of oil that's 80, maybe 90, some people think even $100 a barrel, which we don't see actually right now. So you're going to see in the next few years a crisis in Russia, fiscal crisis in Russia. We see something similar brewing in Saudi Arabia right now. Iran's a basket case already. Abu Dhabi faces some similar troubles and so on. So this pressure is really unusual, and we've been blind, as analysts, we've been blind to this pressure because we've just kind of seen prices go up and rents slosh around and so on, and have not paid enough attention, in my view, to the underlying rising expectations of all that. The third and last thing I'll say brings us really back to what this means for Latin America. And this study that we did, there is tremendous variation around the world in the performance of national oil companies. And that is true also in Latin America. From some of the world's worst oil companies, Pemex, definitely a strong contender there, kind of going for Olympic gold in that competition. Not alone, Kuwait, the Kuwaiti oil company is a horrific oil company. It just is so easy to produce oil in Kuwait. You just put a straw in the ground and out comes oil. That their incompetence has been masked to some degree, whereas Pemex's incompetence has not been masked because of the decline of the main field and the difficulty of bringing new fields online and so on. From best performers to Petrobras, for example, worst performers to Petrobras, for example, which has been, until recently, among one of the very best performing national oil companies. And this is where I'll close, which is one of the reasons that national oil companies tend to perform systematically worse than their peers in the private sector relate in part to Darwin, that national oil companies usually can't fail, whereas in the private sector we have Darwinian mechanisms to weed out incompetence. And especially they relate to the fact that the temptations for government when these rents are sloshing around or when somebody suddenly discovers something new, as has happened in pre-salt, the temptations for government are impossible to hold in. And that's what we're seeing happen right now in Brazil. It'll be interesting to see what folks talk about in Bolivia and Mexico and so on, different situations. And so here you see a company that historically has been one of the very best performing national oil companies that I believe is on the edge of a really rough patch. Petrobras is overinvesting now in Brazil. They're clawing back investments in the rest of the world. They're being forced by the government, in effect, to take positions on pre-salt exploration and production that are making the company overly dependent on a particular kind of field with lots and lots of risks. And risk management in the company, this is the first thing to go always. Risk management in the company no longer represents what a normal kind of privately disciplined oil company would experience. And I think if you add that to the moderating price of oil and possibly even lowering price of oil in the coming years, that's big trouble for Petrobras. And Petrobras has been the best of the Latin American state oil companies, so I'll be interested to learn more about some of the other companies that have not done quite so well. Thank you.
That was great. Pamela.
Thank you. I was asked to talk a little bit about energy nationalism, and then a little bit about Mexico and its peculiar case of Mexico. And after I read the email from Jeremy saying, please talk a little bit about energy nationalism first, and then a little bit about Mexico, I mentioned to my husband that I have to talk about energy nationalism. He says, honey, this is easy. You got your energy, you got your nationalism. You put them together, you got energy nationalism.
That's great.
Isn't that great? But the more I thought about it, he's absolutely right. When you think about energy nationalism, nationalism is all about countries trying to use a natural resource for the benefit of the majority. That's the logic, as opposed to the benefit of individual particular interests. And so the question becomes, when is nationalism more or less likely in one country or another at different points in time? And the question becomes, when is it more or less likely for energy? And energy is a peculiar resource. We see nationalism and resource nationalism affecting all resources, mining, agricultural resources. So energy is a peculiar resource. And it's a peculiar resource in part because of what David was saying, in that the way in which countries can be nationalist about energy is somewhat limited precisely because most of petroleum is already owned by national petroleum countries. And other sorts of energy also tend to be highly state-controlled already. So other ways of being nationalist beyond owning the resource, such as taxing it more effectively or trying to tax it more heavily, more effectively, regulating more effectively, those tools are less useful in the energy sector. So what might lead to more or less nationalism in the energy sector? First and foremost, price. This is true of any resource. Price goes up. There is the sense often in countries whose energy sector or who elements of the energy sector are controlled by private companies, particularly if they're foreign private companies, that the country is getting taken to the cleaners because the profits of the firm are going up, and that just seems unfair because it's our energy, it's our resource. So whenever prices go up, you tend to get more movements toward nationalism. It is not a surprise, therefore, as resource prices went up over the last decade, but particularly in several years leading up to the 2008 crisis, you began to see more resource nationalism, more energy nationalism throughout the world. It's kind of almost like sun comes up in the morning, prices go up, countries feel like they're getting cheated. It's an incentive for there to be more nationalism. If that were the only driver, nationalism would follow the cycle of resource prices, and it doesn't. There are other factors involved. Obviously, it matters for a government. Any government has to determine a cost-benefit politically and economically of moving against a corporation. I'm just going to mention that, leave it aside. I don't want to dig into that. Secondly, is it politically popular? Obviously, if a country is going through an economic crisis, it can be a very useful political tool to blame the problems on the foreigners or blame the problems on the market. So in an economic downturn, more opportunity for nationalism. Third, does the government have the political capacity to act? We tend to see resource nationalism more quickly, more completely in authoritarian regimes because the government generally has much more political room to act than if in a democracy that has a balance of different powers and is federal, which is the worst case. So It depends on the structure of government and also depends on who the leader is. How does the leader navigate effectively or ineffectively a particular political, economic context to be able to implement a policy that is effective at extracting more of the value of a national resource for the nation. So leadership matters as well. But what I really want to talk about is the fourth point, which is economic ideology. Ideology matters a lot. On the train down, I was reading a book by my old boss at Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer, and it's about the rise of state corporations and state capitalism. And he starts the book off, it was really great, quoting the Chinese foreign minister, who in 2009 called together a bunch of big financial people and energy people in New York to have a chat, and Ian was one of these people. And he said, he started the chat by saying the following, quote, "Now that the market has failed, what do y'all think the state," he didn't say y'all, what do you think is the proper role for the state? In other words, market failed, we're done. All over. Markets can't do it, got to go for the state. I'm thinking of a book written by Francis Fukuyama, I think it was 1993, called The End of History, arguing just the opposite. States failed. Oh, problem solved. Don't have to worry about states anymore. It's all about the market. I mean, what those things tell us is that this issue of state dominance of any economic sector, particularly energy sector, versus market dominance is a debate that we've been having in the world pretty much ever since Adam Smith. And the reason we have the debate is because both states and markets screw it up. Markets fail for multiple reasons. We can't even go into the multiple reasons why markets fail. But markets fail above all else because there's incomplete information, there is an incomplete competition, you can't determine property rights, and then we can go on. But there are a number of reasons that markets are not perfectly efficient. We know that. But states fail too. And states fail because the bottom line in a state is political, it's not economic. What can I do to get myself reelected? How do I stay in political office? Often, good economic policy is part of that picture, but not always. And so governments have a motivation to mismanage the economy, mismanage their resources in order to achieve political objectives. So states fail, markets fail. And so inevitably, we see this sort of a pendulum throughout economic history, at least with modern economic history, of governments that tend to rely more on the state, less on the market, and then later we flip the other way. And we tend to flip when we've relied on one strategy, and then there's a crisis. It's like, oh, that one didn't work, let's switch back. And this recent shift back to more reliance on state capitalism, state intervention in the economy, starts with the collapse of the Argentine currency board in 2001, particularly in Latin America, had an enormous negative impact in the region on the Washington consensus, and obviously followed up by the 2008 financial crisis in the United States, which led to the Chinese foreign minister's comment. But this time it's also a little different, because this time we have a very clear alternative model. And in fact, there are two very clear alternative models. Chinese state capitalism, also known as the Beijing Consensus, and the Brazilian approach, which is less state capitalism and more state intervention in the market. They have fewer state-owned corporations, that it's the state companies that are running the economy, more market-based, but heavy state intervention. And because you have those alternative models, when politicians encounter an economic crisis and they're saying, okay, the market failed, we got that. So what's the role for the state? Is it either state capitalism or is it state intervention in a market economy? All of that makes it easier for politicians to play the nationalism card, because now you've got an economic justification for it. Not only are a lot of economists around the world saying the market failed, but you've got two new models that allow you to say, oh, I'll just do that. That will allow, it's worked for Brazil, it's worked for China, I'll do that myself. So even when prices begin to fall, as they have begun to fall in many resource markets in the last 6 months, not so much in petroleum, but we see it in gas, you don't see a reversal, of resource nationalism, because you have all of these other factors driving it. So you got your energy, you got your nationalism. And nationalism plays out in the energy sector usually when you get higher prices, when governments have the motivation and the political capacity to act, but also when you have a preference in global political, economic circles for a more status-based approach. So energy nationalism, resource nationalism is here to stay for a while. So what does this mean in Latin America, and particularly in Mexico? In Latin America, resource nationalism and energy nationalism more tangibly have been associated with a great deal of confrontation. Not the case in Mexico. Mexico is in a peculiar position in that much of the world, when you think about resource nationalism, what they're trying to do is become more resource nationalists. They're trying to enhance state control over their natural resources, over their energy resources. Mexico already has a complete monopoly over it, at least over all petroleum-based resources. And there's significant state control over all kinds of electricity generation, whatever the energy source. So Mexico, the debate is about, okay, how do we make resource nationalism work? How do you guarantee resource nationalism, energy nationalism, and at the same time, energy security? Because the way the company has been mismanaged forever, and just like Kuwait, they could ignore it during the 1980s and early 90s when the Cantarell field was producing, like, by putting a straw in the water basically and getting the oil out. They could ignore it. It came back to haunt them once that field began to decline, and declined dramatically. So how does Mexico balance the need to produce more petroleum and produce it more efficiently with its resource nationalism? And its resource nationalism is deeply ingrained in the Mexican psyche. It is who the country is, because in many ways Mexico is of the revolution. And being of the revolution means you are of the most revolutionary moment in Mexican history, which was the nationalization of 5, was it, petroleum companies in 1938. I think 5, 4. Anyway, it's 2 or 3 American and 2 English. Because this is the first time Mexico had confronted the imperial powers and won. So it's not simply they got control of their natural resource, but for the first time Mexico stood up to great powers and came out ahead. So it has a powerful impact on the Mexican psyche. No Mexican disagrees with that. Resource nationalism is ingrained in the Mexican psyche. What the debate is about in Mexico is, what does nationalism mean? To control our natural resource, do we have to have a monopoly over it? Or can we reduce state ownership while maintaining state control? That's the debate. The most radical voices in Mexico don't call for privatization. They call for, let's make Pemex like Petrobras before the deep salt fields. That's the debate in Mexico. So the question is, briefly, because my 10 minutes are basically up, what is the likelihood of significant change happening in Mexico with the election on July 1st of a new president? Long story short, I think once again we are going to get small but significant steps toward reducing state dominance of the energy sector in Mexico. Small, but significant. Small because even though the incoming president very much wants to transform Pemex into Petrobras, doing so in Mexico is difficult because resource nationalism is ingrained in Mexican law and the Mexican Constitution. You cannot have private investment in the state petroleum company without changing the Constitution. And the president does not have a two-thirds majority in any imagination of coalitions in the national legislature without the left. And the left continues to be adamantly opposed to any private investment in the state petroleum company. Now, there is a chance that the left might change its position in the years ahead, in the next year or two, depending on how internal politics works in that party. But in the meantime, that's not an option. So we're probably going to get smaller reforms. And the one I think is most likely is a dramatic fiscal reform that will allow the state petroleum company to dramatically reduce its tax payments to the government and make it more autonomous. Fiscally, it's already operationally autonomous, but it needs to be fiscally autonomous. And then we'll play with, there was a reform in 2008, when I'm sure most of you are aware, which gives the government more flexibility in the gas sector. So there's likely to be much more investment in shale gas fields in northern Mexico. But a dramatic reform of the petroleum company is unlikely, and it's unlikely because Mexico already did its resource nationalism and is finding hard to step back gradually from that precipice in order to increase energy security. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.